Everybody, and welcome to this panel here. My name is Kim Martins. I'm a professor of aerospace engineering here at the University of Michigan. I'm the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in the department. And as a committee, we have been discussing how to include more DEI content in our courses. And so we decided to invite the faculty that have been successful in doing this to tell us about their experience and inspire us to do the same. And in my view, the ultimate objective is not just to insert DEI for the sake of it, but really to improve learning outcomes. So I make this analogy to my research. I do research on numerical optimization, and there's this notion of potential for finding best designs. And the larger the region you explore, the better potential designs you can get. So I think the same applies to our students. By being more inclusive, by giving everybody the opportunity, we can unleash the true potential of our students. So for this panel, as a reminder, please keep muted your video and your video off throughout the event. Our moderators already have a set of questions prepared that will likely fill the available time. But if you have questions, do post them on the chat and we'll address them if we have time or follow up at a later time. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. Our panelists are Piper Sigrist. They are a third-year PhD candidate in Professor Inman's lab, studying morphing structures and with a minor in Russian and Eastern European studies. And our undergraduate senior, Megan Ennis. She's been very active in the DEI committee, and she's actually going to take a year after she graduates at Cambridge University doing multidisciplinary gender studies. And she's going to come back to U of M to do the SUGS, the masters. So take it away, Piper and Megan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited, looking forward to this conversation. And thank you so much to the panelists for being with us here. We'd like to start and kick things off just by having the panelists say a few words about themselves. Just a quick 1 to 2 minute introduction, where you work, types of research that you're conducting, things of those nature, and perhaps like a favorite tip that you have for incorporating DEI into your classrooms and your education. So let's go ahead and we'll just go in order that I see on my screen here. So Kathy S., are you okay with kicking us off here?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kathy Sevener. I am a lecturer in the Material Science and Engineering Department. I'm one of 2 DEI lecturers in the College of Engineering, and I'm also the DEI department lead for the department. I actually teach in the MSc 220 course that most Aero students are required to take. So I see a fair number of Aero students in my class each fall. And then I also teach a couple of courses where I'm seeing more and more Aero students, mechanical behavior of materials and also composites with a focus on manufacturing. The Aero course focuses on structures and analysis. So one of the things I've been involved in as a DEI lecturer is interviewing faculty on inclusive teaching. And just the DEI tip or thing that I like to bring up is that for faculty and anyone who is concerned about the amount of work or effort it takes to think about creating an inclusive classroom, it's actually really quite easy in that anything you do to improve student learning in general is going to make the classroom more comfortable and inclusive for pretty much any other student. So thinking about identity and thinking about where people are coming from, those are actually really fairly easy hurdles to cross when you're thinking about how to structure your course and try to get more students engaged in the course.
Awesome, thank you so much. Ken, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Ken Powell. I'm a professor in the Aero department, and I teach mostly flows, fluid mechanics, aerodynamics, things like that. But I've also taught freshman computing, computational fluid dynamics, and things like that. I think part of my thinking about DEI is just informed by having three grown kids. They're all in their 20s, and 2 of my daughters are in STEM fields. My 2 daughters are in STEM fields. My son's a musician. So that I think, I think for most of us, our parenting situation informs some of our thoughts about these things. one thing I've done recently, I think this was kind of, for me, motivated by COVID, but I think in general, it's a practice I'm going to try to keep up because it helps, I think, make the classroom inclusive, is I've, at the beginning of the class, by video nowadays, right, basically introduced myself and talked pretty personally about, my home life and how I got to where I am as a professor. And then I've asked each student to submit a 1, 2, 3 minute audio or video recording doing a similar thing for themselves. And that's been nice. The 2 students talk about why they got interested in Aero, what they hope for the class, what they're concerned about. That's something I think I'm going to keep doing. I should say that I lifted it from Anouk Gerard. She introduced me to that concept.
Thank you so much. Great advice. Up next, Kathy Clark.
Hi, I'm Kathy Clark. I'm the Associate Chair of Movement Science in the School of Kinesiology. I have an adjunct position in aerospace engineering because my research and background, I used to be NASA's chief scientist for human spaceflight. So Tony Wace is interested in bringing human spaceflight into engineering, and we were going to start developing classes, and then COVID hit and everybody started dog paddling, so we haven't done that. My experience with DEI is very different from most other people because the course I teach, which is called scientific writing, it's actually a scientific argumentation class, but it's essentially an independent study. And so I have the opportunity to spend time getting to know my students on a very individual level. The trickiest part is to make sure that they're willing to engage with that. And I like Ken's idea, and I have done that. I've asked students to let me know ahead of time what their questions are, what their interest is, why they got to be there. And so in a normal term, they come into my office a lot, and we spend time partly talking about, tragically, the difference between affect and effect. But in addition to that, science and their interest in science and their loves, and a lot of times their personal life. I've gotten to know students very well. So I enjoy that aspect of it. And I would really hate to have to teach a class any other way, just because I find that so useful for getting to know somebody, at their own level, as opposed to trying to sort of make students fit into, sort of a lecture situation. So that's kind of been the way I've been running things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ella?
Hi, I'm Ella Atkins. I'm a professor of aerospace and robotics at the University of Michigan. In aerospace, when I first showed up in 2006, I developed a couple of courses, graduate aerospace information systems, and then an undergraduate flight software systems course, and spent a lot of time, like Ken Powell, teaching freshman programming. And for me, I think one of the most rewarding parts of teaching freshman programming is definitely not standing in front of a class of 225 students where the faces are very small and you struggle to recognize people. I have struggled and not figured out how to really support DEI in that, other than trying to make sure the arrogant students who are obnoxious don't kind of poison the Q&A periods in those lectures. But some of the most rewarding experiences are when a student who lacks confidence shows up to office hours and kind of looks at you and said, I really didn't think I should talk to the professor. And I'm like, wait, don't leave, show me your code, right? Those are the moments that are the most fun, where you actually take somebody who was afraid of a professor and turn them into someone who's going to come back, and you eventually learn about their life and can maybe they don't make an A, it doesn't even matter, right? But what has happened there is that they've discovered that professors are humans and are interested in you, and they can go on from there. In robotics, I was grad chair. I've taught several lab courses there. And the lab courses I find really rewarding because I have experienced throughout my career in aerospace that there is a marked stereotype that says women should not be as good at hands-on. And that is unfortunate. And I don't believe it. But it's there whether you like it or not. So part of my job in those lab classes is to make sure that any sort of underrepresented student who is not sought for advice by their teammates, by the end of the term is sought for advice. Not because they know more, but because they know as much, and because it's part of the creative process, part of the, how you do business. And for me, that's pretty rewarding to get to the end of the term where some of the students are like, wow, I didn't think I could do this, but look, I kind of even led the team. So that's kind of some of my fun stuff. And as grad chair, I think there also are a lot of opportunities to encourage students to understand who's responsible versus not responsible. Our grad coordinator always makes jokes that she's not responsible, but what that in turn means is that students can confide in her without her running to the dean's office and saying this is what the student said. So anytime there's some kind of conflict, whether it's Title IX or some other type of issue, it's always good for students to have places to go that they trust people. And so there's a role for the responsible employee and for the not so responsible employee, and having students understand that is important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Professor Hallow.
Or George. Thank you, Piper. I'm actually glad I went after Ella, because I think Ella made a comment about safe places and trust. And that's probably where I think I'd like to start. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a professor in aerospace engineering, and I spent more decades than I'd care to recount at Ford Motor Company before coming here and being a professor. I was hired actually to do leadership and professionalism, loosely termed, which is sort of taking the really great technical stuff we do in aerospace here, and then try to help the students package it in, you know, applications in an industry environment. So I also do systems engineering and things of that nature as well. So in terms of safe places, so yeah, I'm a white male. I grew up in an affluent suburb, and I've basically, you know, had a silver spoon in my mouth since the day I was born, and have been just very, very fortunate. But I also like to think that I have a real sense of fairness. And as a result, you know, I always try to make sure that we level the playing field as much as possible. And, you know, so even when I was at Ford, and I did a lot of mentoring when I was at Ford of young engineers. And, you know, I mean, I don't know the exact demographics. I'm guessing that we probably had 35 to 40% female engineers there. But if you look at the mentees that I had, it was probably 75% women. And I'm not kidding, it was probably that skewed. And I talked to a director friend of mine, a female director friend who had retired around the same time I did. I asked her about that at one point. And she said, no, you know, we all women talk, and we all know where the safe places to go are. And she said, it's not surprising that you have that many women coming to you for help and mentorship. And then the same thing applies here, where I think, you know, a majority of the students, or at least probably half the students that I mentor, maybe even more, are female. And as we know, those of us in aerospace, the percentage of aerospace engineering students is what, 14, 15%. So it is relatively skewed. But I am trying to make a difference. I think one other thing I'd build up on what Ella said is that, you know, there's this prevailing opinion, you know, in labs and in fabrication facilities, you know, we want people that are hands-on and have experience. And then, you know, that just kind of translates into white male. And, you know, I'm doing, in fact, now I'm leading the effort within the Department of Aerospace Engineering to do the GSI and IA lab allocations here amongst the lab professors. And when I first took over the role a year and a half ago, really all of the GSIs and most of the IAs looked a lot like me. And so we've quietly tried to start a revolution, starting with one female who we brought into 205, and, you know, and she did a phenomenal job, and it's begot some more. And so, you know, we look at, in fact, just ironically, just this morning, I was talking with one of the professors and going over the candidates for what we're going to do for this coming fall. And on the IA side, for sure, it's a vast majority of the candidates are female. And so we're trying to get, and you know, we also have a male of color as a GSI candidate. And so we're trying to start building the bench strength so that we can get that, you know, moving through the pipeline, and then get a much better representation of our lab support, you know, both GSI and IA going forward. I'd also add too, and I don't know how much time you want to give me for this, but the other thing in terms of what I do for classes, so I teach an introduction to the aerospace enterprise course. And, you know, in that one, we spend an awful lot of time trying to you know, invoke DEI principles. You know, for example, when we talk about history, we don't only talk about Neil Armstrong and you know, Wilbur and Orville Wright and you know, and the like that. We also talk about, you know, Amelia Earhart. We talk about Bessie Coleman. We talk about the Tuskegee Red Tails. We do a lot and try to talk about, you know, contributions to aerospace of all demographics. We also have some pretty tough conversations around, you know, diversity, inclusion, microaggression, things like that. And then at Aero 495, which is a systems engineering and lab course that I do, this is all team-based, and we spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time talking with the captains about training future leaders for those teams, and making sure that we maintain diversity there as well. And quite happy to say that for the 3 teams that are in the course, they started the course this year, all white males as captains. And of the 3, right now, we've confirmed 1 female captain for next year for the team, one of the teams. And then the other team is probably on the verge of appointing a female captain or so in the next week. So we're trying to get that going as well. And, at the grassroots level. And I think it's starting to take some hold, which is good news.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That actually segues beautifully into our first question. We'll go ahead and dive in here. Yeah, Professor Holloway, George, excuse me. I think you really touched on, some of the inequities and inequalities that you have observed in engineering education. So with that being said, I'd like to ask the other panelists as well, what inequity and inequality have you observed in your time as a professor that stems from personal or systemic biases? How did you come to realize that this was a problem, and what actions did and will you take to make your classroom situation more inclusive and equitable for all of your students? And we'll go ahead and start with Ella.
Yeah, so let's say personal. One of the things I didn't say about myself is that I grew up on a small farm in rural West Virginia. In fact, I'm there right now, always struggling with internet since we're remote. That is considered one of the diverse environments, right? At Michigan, people from the UP and other areas where there's light population density struggle to get the AP content, just like other kind of more populated, underserved communities. One of the things that results from the, not to use George's term, having a silver spoon in your mouth from day one is that there's a different set of life experiences that you bring to your education. And part of that is, I remember when I went from West Virginia to MIT, there was a pretty sudden step change. And first of all, I needed to change my accent. The people of Boston did not respect me because of my accent. It was very Appalachian. Now it's mixed. Nobody knows where I am. It was all about changing the vowels. Should I have needed to do that? No. In 1984, I did. The second thing was there's a certain formality, right? I went to a hasty pudding club event at Harvard when I was a freshman, and I will remember that for the rest of my life. The term fish out of water doesn't even begin to describe how it was. And I'm not going to go into details, but that was really a jarring experience. And one of the important things that I think professors and other students and everybody talking about DEI need to recognize is that we don't all come from the same cultural background. And so when we have activities on campus, you shouldn't assume that the small talk and the typical conversation topics that you are familiar with from your silver spoon background are the things that the others want to talk about. So how do we get past that? Well, I've experienced those roadblocks, but I've watched students experience those roadblocks. If someone wants to talk about something they experienced and it doesn't connect well with the largely college prep trained students in a team or in a classroom group, then often one has to step back and say, how does one deal with that? And it's not simple, because you can't say, smack to all you college trained people, this culture is not the only way to be successful in aerospace engineering, robotics, or whatever you're pursuing. It's really about learning problem solving and interacting well to solve those problems, which may or may not involve a particular expectation culturally that you have inherited from when you were very young. So I've been trying to fight those, but the problem is I get stuck in these roadblocks themselves because I tend to be very informal. And sometimes people misconstrue that as me being incapable. And that's something that I now am confident about. So if somebody wants to go on Rate My Professor and rake me over the coals because they think that I'm not competent, let them do it, because I actually know what I'm doing. And so there's kind of those back and forths that are so important. And the reason I'm here sharing this is because it took me personally a long time to clamber up to that level of confidence where I could say what I've just said. And I like to think that others will listen and clamor there faster.
Can I add one thing to what Ella just said too? And I think this is a great example of just a horrible inequity right now. And, I kind of have a casual, loose style too. And sometimes I use colloquialisms and sometimes I use maybe, I want to say profanity. I want to be careful about that, but I'll use just some really, basic and raw language. And people look at me and say, hey, Halo's a cool guy, because he can do that. If Ella does it, she's not capable. And it's just, it's criminal. And it's just it breaks my heart as a bottom line. And we just need to do something to fix it.
Thank you so much for building on that point. I was actually, thinking of the same thing as Ella was talking, sitting here like, oh my gosh, like how many women have had to battle with this, even with things as, being confident, being perceived as, a not nice B word. Yeah, so I'd like to ask Professor Sevener, Kathy, excuse me, as well, to respond to this question about any inequities and inequalities you've observed.
Well, my comments are actually related to Ella's, although I must totally agree with her. If I present myself as informal, I'm not seen as competent, but if I present myself more formally, I certainly have seen that unpleasant B word used to describe me by students. So there is that we all face in this culture. But the one thing that I noticed early on, and I suffer from it, has to do with imposter syndrome. And this work that we all need to do to make our classrooms more inclusive involves, I think, the faculty taking that step back to say, to acknowledge that our students are struggling with thinking they don't belong, thinking they're not good enough. When you start to do a derivation and you say, oh, this is easy, those students in the classroom who, it's been a couple of years since they did those derivations in calc and they're not really sure they know what they're doing, they start to think they don't belong. So I take some very careful steps in my teaching to talk about failure and to talk about situations where things are difficult. And so in the case of doing a particular calc derivation, I will often use the analogy where I start out saying, the first time I took differential equations, and that catches students off guard because I'm admitting that I took differential equations a second time. But I use that as an example because the first time I took differential equations, the faculty member would skip steps. And when you're learning for the first time, when he stands up there and says, from this equation, it's obvious the solution is such and such, I was like, I've never been in a calc class before where I didn't understand what was going on and I didn't understand what was going on. So I dropped the class. And when I took it the second time, then I had an instructor who didn't skip steps. So when I want to say, this points us to an exponential function, I explain why. Because even if a student knew that and learned that in their differential equations class, there are some students who may not have totally understood what was going on. And so that's one of the ways that I try to address this idea that I don't belong here because that doesn't make sense. And I do things like, if I'm going through an example and there's a technical example that is being used. So a thrust bearing was an example that I had from a mechanics course. And I took a step back and said, well, when I was a student, I had no idea what a thrust bearing did. So I take a minute to explain what a thrust bearing does in a particular, what its function is, before then I go through the force analysis to talk about how we develop the stresses in that structure. So those are ways that I have recognized inequality and challenges for the students, and I try to address those in my teaching.
Great. Thank you everyone for going over that question. The next question that I want to introduce to everyone is, what are your thoughts on inspiring other professors and students to be involved and motivated to pursue a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment? So what kind of, what are your thoughts or ideas or actions that you've done to involve other people in DEI? So I'll start with Ken.
Thanks. So one of the kind of seminal experiences I've had here while I've been at Michigan around DEI was, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, maybe more. someone asked me to be on this committee called STRIDE, which is Strategies and Tactics for Recruiting to Increase Diversity and Excellence. So the idea is about a group of senior faculty from the university, about a dozen of us, sit around a table once a month. We read social science literature. Part of the number, about half the people at the table are social scientists, and the rest of us are in STEM fields. And it's all about, you know, things that you that are engaged in this kind of work know about, like unconscious bias, imposter syndrome, terms that have come up today. And is a great experience. And so I felt I should leverage that, that knowledge that I've built up with a lot of work, actually, by talking about it, right? Going out and both at departments here at Michigan and also at other schools, talking about what I've learned about how these things come up, particularly in our fields. And I will say that as a senior male white faculty member, one of the few places I can go and have a crippling case of imposter syndrome is standing up in front of a group of people and talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, race, right? Because that's not a lived experience for me, and I'm not formally trained in social science. So that's probably good for me, but it's, you know, out of my comfort zone, right? And so I then want to encourage people like me to step up and do this kind of work, because it's the majority people that need to do the lion's share of DEI work. It benefits us, it benefits the whole community, and it can't be on the backs of the people who are, you know, in the underrepresented groups. So I'm trying to be a resource to people who are stepping up, right? Both here in the college, but also outside the college. So that would be a primary thing I would say about how I try to help out. I will say that I also occasionally nudge people, push people into, you know, volunteering, or try to convince them that it's something they could do. And I don't know if King is nodding his head right now, I can't see him, but I did kind of push him into being the DEI lead for the department, and talked about why I think it's important, why I think he'd be good at it, and so on.
Great, thank you. And next, Kathy Sevener. Oh wait, sorry. Oh yeah. I meant to say Ella.
Yeah. Ken, it is such a hugely more effective thing when you present the 585 slides than if someone like me were to do it, because there's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? You're not self-serving in any way by presenting those slides, so people buy into it. There's no other interpretation that they could have than that this speaker means that. When I present them, it's more likely that the audience will say, oh, she just wants something for herself. And no, that's not what would be the case if I were to present those slides. Really, I would present those slides as information, and hope that people would listen. But you're so correct that the majority has to be involved, because otherwise there are all kinds of interpretations that might happen. I think for me, the inspiring other people has been through individual contact, and then that paying forward to other individual contacts or small groups, because when you're in a big setting, it's hard to really get to the bottom of people's life and goals. And, you know, when I say life, I don't mean privacy invading parts of it. I mean just like, what thoughts do they bring into their career aspirations, and what do they want to get out of being at the University of Michigan, and what do they want to do when they leave? That's a very individual story. So one of the things that I did as grad chair for robotics over the years was to actually schedule Zoom meetings with accepted students, even though they weren't going to be mine, to just talk to them about these things and try to connect. It wasn't just a sales pitch. I'm probably going to get fired for saying this. Actually, I have tenure, so I won't. But anyway, I actually, on more than one occasion, have encouraged students to go elsewhere, even though we were trying to recruit them to Michigan, because after hearing someone's story, if you're like, well, hey, you should go there, not here, then, you know, that's something that needs to be said. It didn't happen often, right? It's just one or two times, but I've, you know, it was always for my students I was trying to recruit, because I wouldn't do that to another faculty. But I think that personal contact and really exploring what it means to have an inclusive environment, right? what are things that make an environment inclusive versus potentially, watching people fall silent. And in the small group scenarios, anytime you're in a discussion and someone falls silent, it probably does involve that imposter syndrome or them not feeling like people care what they have to say, which is different than the imposter syndrome, and then trying to do something to draw people back into that conversation. And one of the things about aerospace is that there are a lot of surveys that have happened. Why is it so bad with respect to the gender and minority inclusion in the community? And there are lots of answers, but nowhere do I feel that bias more acutely than when I go to a Department of Defense event. And I don't know that I should say a lot more than that, but it's a problem. And people think I'm a human factors researcher because I'm female, and I can watch them become more excited when I start to talk about people, and that shouldn't happen. So I try to fix them then by talking about autonomy. And so that's also part of the inspiration, right? Is to say, look, this is what I do. This is the algorithms. This is the code. This is the quantitative results. And you go from there. And I think the main message, though, is spend the time with your office door open, inviting people in and trying to deal with individuals in small groups in a personal way to create a friendly environment, because that's good for everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Next, George.
Okay, well, once again, I'm going to build up on what Ella said, and particularly what she said about Ken. So a couple things on this. I think there's probably a short-term and a long-term solution. I think long-term, and I don't know if who on this call was, saw the COE lecture that, panel that we did a month or so ago, but, there's the long term. I presented some data in that, and it just showed the inequities in terms of faculty hiring. When you look at the average demographics of middle-aged adult, and then you compare that to college professors, it's very, very skewed. And I think longer term, we can help create a more healthy environment here just by getting closer to the right, the demographics that mirror society. Something that helps long term, but short term, I think what Ella said about Ken is right on the money. I think those of us that are in a privileged position just have to be more open and speak out about it. Dr. Martin Luther King, he said the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. And then Ben Franklin also said, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And if you look at those things, what it really says is that folks like Ken, King, myself, Vasilios, Dan, I'm just looking at the aero professors that are on here, Mark, the more, and again, we don't need to do it in a flagrant or, an inflammatory fashion, but just be more open and talk about it and create those inclusive environments. And I think those kinds of things will help get our environments to feel more safe and, start to alleviate some of the tension and the pain that I think that is there today.
Thank you all so much for those very thoughtful responses, particularly in using privilege to, create safe spaces for other people who are underrepresented. And again, that segues really beautifully into the next question we'd like to discuss here. How do you show support for underrepresented minorities in aerospace engineering? And how do you help make a safe space for underrepresented voices? And let's hear from Kathy Clark first.
Well, first of all, you have to keep in mind that I don't do a whole lot in the aerospace engineering field, but I did spend a large chunk of my career building an international space station. And there were 16 countries and roughly 14 different languages going on there. And the interactions are the same. It's the same problems. You have stronger countries who are stepping up, stepping out, and stepping on the smaller countries who want to be a part of it. You have different cultures that lead scientists from, say, Japan to be unwilling to push back and fight because that's their culture, that is different from someone from Germany who's going to jump in and really fight for things and really argue. And you have to figure out how to deal with that. And and luckily I then ended up in a position here at Michigan where I could kind of take that concept into my classroom. And what I find is a really nice way to bring students in is to help get some of the more forward students, the more bold ones, the ones who have less of the imposter syndrome, to actually begin bringing in some of the students who are a little bit less bold. And again, I'm very fortunate because my class is very small, and I break them further into smaller groups, and they work together. And they find, and I tell them, again, given my background, it's the diversity that makes it work. It's the different perspectives that makes it worthwhile. It's hard, but you always benefit from bringing that to the table, from letting everybody's voices be heard. And so my students find that they do that and they learn. And by the end of class, a lot of them are saying, oh, I had no idea that I could learn this much from someone who's so different than I am. And I kept saying, but that's the benefit of having someone who's so different. If you only listen to voices that are the same as yours, what are you going to learn? And that's been really a real fun thing for me. And as I work my way, hopefully, into doing more in aerospace engineering, I would like to be able to bring that same idea, that same concept to the table.
That's really powerful. Yeah, thank you for sharing how you inspire your own students to start becoming this change. That is so important to see. Ella, do you have anything that you'd like to add for this question?
Well, I think that's the best thing to say. What Kathy just now said. I think there are things that one can do to just help people imagine what a world would be like if opportunities were cut out for underrepresented individuals, and then also to imagine what the community would be like if inclusion was more persistent, more successful. And I don't know that people want to go to AIAA events and see others who just look like themselves. That happens, but I don't think they want that. So when you notice that, you have to comment on it and say, well, how do we stop this? And it's not just by token individuals, it's by this kind of broad base figuring out how to actually be inclusive. And I think that that's a pretty compelling story, because if you actually approach somebody and says, look, this is not inclusive. Yes, we have a speaker, a keynote that comes from some underrepresented community, and that's awesome. But then we have 15% of the population otherwise at this conference that comes from any underrepresented community total. If you sum all of them up, that doesn't represent success. And so then through committees and outreach and education and all of the things that we try to do, you can begin to change it, but you have to have those reminders. That's all.
Yeah, thank you very much. George.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know that I would add a lot to what Ella just said. I think it's really, and even Kathy, I think it's just trying to create that open environment that that we can discuss these things in a non-confrontational way, and that it just people just feel comfortable, and it's always a fine line too. And I try not to be over militant about it. I don't want to make the white males feel disenfranchised in the conversation either. And so far, I mean, I guess we probably need to poll my students to know if this statement is accurate or not. But if you look at some of the conversation that we've had in my Aero 200 class, and we had Karen Albrecht, by the way, come and do just a fantastic lecture that many said was the best lecture of the semester. And it talked about DEI and microaggression and just sort of safe environments. We tend to have pretty healthy conversation when we can try to find that right balance between making sure that everybody understands that it's an issue, but that it's not the fault of the privileged in the room, as long as they are part of the solution. I should say it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your comments about your personal experiences and stressing the importance of DEI. Next kind of set of questions is more focusing on classroom practices. So the next question is, what classroom practices have been most successful at bringing awareness to students about DEI issues in your experience? I'll start that question with Ella, if you don't mind.
Hey, I have largely failed at bringing DEI to Aero 201, but I'm going to talk about 201 anyway, because some of you have been there. Talking about spacesuits brought to the fore that over the past couple of times that I taught it. So for example, if you look at the size and the design of spacesuits, and I'm not an expert, I'm looking at someone else on the screen here who knows a lot more, right? The gloves, right? It's very hard to do things in spacesuit gloves. And if you think about the planned spacewalks a year ago, right? They didn't have the right size for the female astronauts ready to go. And if you look at the cockpits of aircraft, right? I am a big Patty Wagstaff fan. She's been kind of my idol of flying since I was a kid, and she's a little older than me, so yay. But one of the things that's great about some of the books that people like Patty have written are they actually just cut to the core of cockpits being designed for men, even though women are not at a disadvantage as fighter pilots, as aerobatic pilots in any way, shape, or form. And that's something that can be brought out in those types of lectures, even though most of the course is math. In lab classes, I think the kind of dynamics that you can see if a student is quiet and reserved because they lack confidence versus a student being very in your face, kind of I'm always there with something to say. One can kind of stroll by and kind of get involved in the conversation. And if one makes eye contact and is very careful to make eye contact a lot and ask questions that are very welcoming of the people who aren't saying a lot, then one can gradually help set up a dynamic where that happens more often. And I always enjoy doing that because I also get to meet the students and talk with them and learn about them. So things like that, I guess, in the lab classes. And like I said, in the freshman coding class, I really, really have had great experiences with people who felt they could never code that eventually worked up the courage to come by. I know Ken has seen a lot of this too. And like the first 10 minutes they're in your office, they're just like, I'm sorry to be here. I am an imposter. I'm a loser. I shouldn't be here. Please take pity on me and answer my question. And the most rewarding experience is when they leave half an hour later and they're like, I can't believe you just spent a half an hour with me. And you're like, well, why not? It's office hours, welcome. And they come back again and again. And at the end of the course, they're like, I actually kind of know how to program.
Can I follow up on that briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, as Ella said, I taught Engine 101. I was one of the people who developed the course and taught it the first few years. And I'm nodding because exactly this is one of the most amazing things about teaching Engine 101 is you have disproportionately white male students coming in being cocky about their programming skills, and disproportionately female and students of color coming in being underconfident about their abilities. And it turns out, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but people's ability to get through that course and do well had much more to do with how they'd been doing in their math courses than how much program they had done before. And to Ella's point, one of the great satisfactions teaching that class was seeing some students who came in underconfident, really excel at the end. But a situation where my biases affected my teaching negatively was in that Engine 101 and around that. When I had people come to me who were underconfident, I so wanted to help that I overhelped them. And it was interesting. While I was teaching that class, I read a paper in the Chronicle of Higher Education about overteaching. I had never been exposed to this concept before. And the idea is it's the road to hell, is paved with good intentions, right? So I want to help, but my way of helping was to basically lead the people I was worried about, by the nose or whatever through the coding, rather than kind of gently nudging them in the right direction so they would learn it themselves. So I had to kind of readjust after that semester and say, somehow I have to find the right balance between being really encouraging to people, really building up their confidence, helping to get through this, but not doing it for them. So, and it's still something I struggle with.
That's a great point.
And I want to jump in. I got to say this because we're talking about coding, and I always love to talk about coding. there is a real risk in aerospace engineering that the coding part of the curriculum gets swept under the carpet enough that those people who lack confidence, that have this imposter syndrome, will not recover from that until they graduate because of that sweeping of the coding under the carpet. Engine 101 is not enough to solve that problem. So I hope someone's listening that cares.
Okay, since we're jumping, I just have to jump because you mentioned spacesuit. The real issue with the spacewalking is not a gender issue, it's a size issue. There's an enormous advantage into being tall, having large hands, having long legs. That's just the physics of the walk. And so you're right, a lot of times the women get left out of it, but we're finding more and more the tall women actually are good spacewalkers, and we don't have any problem with that. I do have to laugh because one of the biggest issues in designing a spacesuit for women is the biology of having them be able to urinate while they're on a spacewalk. And that engineering feat was much, much more difficult than anybody thought it was going to be. And dear Kathy Sullivan was the woman who put up with it for months as they tried to figure out how to fit her. But she's my size, she's 6 feet tall, and she's a great spacewalker, and she ended up doing that. But boy, she put up with a lot to get ready for it.
Great, good discussion, everyone. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it off to George. What practices have you done in the classroom to have been successful with DEI?
Yeah, so I've mentioned a couple of them already, relative to in my enterprise course, where we talk about the history and then try to talk about inclusivity. Or actually, we approach it from a position of inclusivity. A number of other things, and I'll preface it all by saying too that it's really, really hard. Actually, you have to work at it a lot. I mean, this is not I can't just snap my fingers and in the first day of lecture say this is going to be an inclusive classroom and then everybody follows along. It doesn't work that way. It's you got to build it layer by layer. It's a lot of work. Now, but if it's in your side, if it's in your heart, and if you really embody it, it's not that difficult. You just have, but you have to be vigilant and do it all the time. You have to invoke a lot of methods. Another one is make sure that you call on people, or you listen to see who's dominating conversation and those who aren't. And oftentimes it is women that seem to feel in aerospace classes that they are a little more imposter syndrome. They can't speak up. So you try to figure out who is not participating as much, and then you create that safe environment, and then you call on them or encourage them to speak up. And then you have to follow that up too. If they say something that's relevant, that's really, that's positive, you celebrate it. You make it a point. Yeah, boy, Alana, that was a great point you just made. I hadn't even thought of that myself, but that's a really insightful comment. And, then you build upon that. And if you do things like that, then the average student will look at, oh yeah, well, there's a lot of women in this class and they're making really good contributions. And it starts to, the stereotypes start to break down when you demonstrate that, day by day, week by week, lecture by lecture. Again, so it's not, you can't just put language in a syllabus and say my course is going to be inclusive. You have to work at it and you have to create that environment.
Thank you so much. Very good points. With the next question, we kind of want to dig a little bit deeper into the classroom practices that you all have implemented for DEI. Specifically, we're curious if the successful practices that you have implemented differ between different sizes of classroom. For example, in a small room with 15, 20 students versus a large lecture hall. And if these practices do differ, what do you find works best for each situation? And we'd love to start with Kathy S.
Yeah, this one's hard. Large classes are very difficult. One of my practices for small classes is to learn students' names, and that when you get into my large lectures of 120 and even as many as 70 students, it becomes difficult. You just simply can't learn everyone's names. So there are different practices, and in the interviews that I've done with faculty, the large class sizes are a big challenge. But one exercise that I have found that helps in terms of at least priming the pump in terms of thinking about diversity is the first day of class, having students answer questions about how many different states have you lived in? And so I'll have people put up their hands and eventually bring their hands down as we get up at higher and higher numbers. So 1, 2, 3, I think the highest I've gotten so far is 8 different states. And then I use that as a segue into talking about the diversity of experiences and cultures within the United States that these people have experienced by living in different states. And so many of our students are coming from outside of Michigan, and they're experiencing Michigan for the first time, or they only experience Michigan as a student. And then I also do the same thing with countries and talk, how many countries have you lived in? And I think the limit there, I think I've gotten 4 or 5. But again, use that as a segue into talking about the value of learning about different cultures and languages, and thinking about the experiences that those people have had. And then I actually, if people are willing to volunteer, I ask them what country they've lived in or what state they've lived in and what their favorite city is. And we get a discussion going about different aspects of that. So I found that even in a large classroom, that's pretty successful in terms of having the students engage and thinking about diversity in a different way. But you also have not just the large, small class size, but large lectures versus laboratory courses. And for laboratories, you can think about how the lab is structured. Faculty can actually go through their own exercises to help create the environment before they ever even teach the lab, thinking about how do my students traverse the space. So are my students familiar with the equipment that's in the lab? Are they going to be able to move past the equipment? Are there any students with disabilities who won't be able to traverse the space? Do I have any implicit assumptions in how I write my laboratory exercises about what they should or shouldn't know about the equipment? In the diagrams of the equipment, if I'm telling them to go and turn this knob, is it clear what knob I'm referring to? And could I include a picture to make it more clear? So I've actually worked with some other faculty to create essentially a laboratory checklist. So for anyone who wants to make their laboratory course more inclusive, to be able to go through this and think about asking these questions and answering them. And it can be done with an existing lab as well, to think about how the students interact in the space, how they interact with the equipment and with each other in the space. And then what am I assuming they know, and what do I need to teach them for them to be successful in that space?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting and wonderful to hear how the practices you've implemented both engage the students directly with raising their hands, as well as involve things that you and your lab staff perform a bit more internally, I suppose. So next, let's go ahead and bounce back to Professor Hallow. George, excuse me again.
No problem. Either way is fine. My lectures tend to be pretty interactive, whether it's 130 students or 25 students. So, on the surface, there's probably not a whole lot of difference as to how I approach those two. There are some at the sublayer, but I would also mention too that, I pride myself on the ability to remember all my students' names, as Kathy mentioned, and then have open dialogue. I get some feedback at the end of the term in the course grades that says that, class discussions are great, but they tend to be dominated by 5 or 6 or 7 people. And that's a problem because, obviously they're the most extroverted, and the ones in the class are the ones that speak up much. And so what I'm starting to try to do is I'm trying to, draw out input from others. Small classes are similarly interactive, but it is definitely a lot easier, making sure that you call on a lot of different people and giving a lot of people a chance to talk. It's just easier that way. And it's also easier live than in Zoom, I've noticed. We still have some really good, sort of interaction in the chats during my classes, as Kathy Clark knows, but it's just not the same. When you're in a classroom, you can call physically on people. You can see people that are sitting down looking at their phones. There's no such thing as video muting in a classroom, which is great. And you can really, sort of play off, facial expressions, bodily, position and things like that. The large classroom does bring some challenges. And so what I always try to do is I try to really, monitor who's participating and contributing. And when we're doing the Zoom calls, I will watch the chat pretty carefully, even if I'm lecturing. And if I see really good comments in the chat, I will stop and I'll point the comment out and I will react to it verbally live in the room. And again, I think what it does, I try to make sure that those that don't feel comfortable speaking up, but will use the chat, I will actually pause and even ask them to speak up or maybe reinforce their point, just so they, they get through that. They realize nobody died, and hey, I can actually speak up in this class, and it's okay. So yeah. So anyway, there are differences, and you just have to sort of manage through them.
Thank you so much for extending the discussion to include the virtual classroom as well. I think it's very poignant given the past year. And so to wrap up this question here, can we hear from Ella?
Sure. The successful parts of bringing awareness to students. I'm going to talk about two things. One, back to the freshman programming. So Ken was one of the people that created Engine 101. I'm the person that created Engine 151. And a lot of people, and part of the reason to create Engine 151 was to provide a challenge for the students that were ready for it, and especially those that weren't going to computer science, they got to do more. But the secondary, and I think in my opinion, a primary purpose of creating Engine 151 was to make sure that those that may have felt some imposter syndrome didn't have those students that went into 151 sitting there in the classroom telling them how easy everything was. And that's not really a a noble thing that you do as an instructor, but it's kind of one of the behind the scenes things that kind of was important, because there was such an overwhelming feeling of I can't do this when there was a student sitting next to somebody else who was mumbling, oh, I've known this since I was 6. I've played all these video games. I've written these scripts. I've tested these codes. I've hacked on the internet, blah, 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 blah. And once that happened, I think everybody's classroom in 101 got better, because somebody who was overqualified now had a place to go. So it empowered everyone to say, why aren't you in 151? You shouldn't be sitting here grumbling because you have another option. You're not being forced to sit here. But that's a tiny thing. I guess I think it's really important to highlight complementary skills. I've taught a lot of projects that had, or a lot of classes that had either projects or lab components. And one of the things that's so important is to understand in a group setting where there's a project that maybe one person has always loved to do something like design a 3D part and 3D print it, and that's just what they want to do when they wake up in the morning. But maybe somebody else wants to write code, right? You have to do that too if you're going to actually have this widget, say a robot, do something. Maybe somebody else actually liked that circuits class when they took it, as opposed to people in aerospace going, oh, I don't need to really know much about electrical circuits. Why am I in that class, right? Or maybe somebody analyzed the structure and materials and said, I know how to build this, so it's not going to fall apart. Well, if you actually put everybody in the same room instead of having them sit quietly or grumble because nobody else wants to talk about that structure or material or the code, then you find out how to fit them all together as pieces of a system. Then you can celebrate the system and the diversity of the elements in that system instead of everybody grumbling because the others don't want to talk about their favorite widget. And I think that for me personally has been more successful in the robotics teaching that I've done, because there's kind of going in that, yeah, there are some people that are experts in one thing, but they actually want to be experts in everything else, which has made it a lot easier. And I would like to see that sort of thing go more into the Aero project. So I guess right now, the people who have their phones on, I'm looking at George right now, but there's especially good opportunities for that in the senior design classes, in the student teams, and in the lab classes that involve.
Great. Thank you everyone for all of your comments. The next kind of section that we're going to go into is, like, after the classroom practices, is more of the obstacles that you may have faced when working with this. So the first question is, what classroom practices have been met with the most resistance from students in your experience? And to start us off, I'm going to start with Kathy Sevener.
I was thinking about this question before the panel and struggling because I don't get a lot of resistance. A lot of students are passive. They're like, oh no, she's going to make us do this. We're going to have to do this. But when I look at course evaluations, I was remembering that I actually have quite a few students who complain about group work, who complain about there's exercises. There's one's called Think, Pair, Share, where you pair students and you have them discuss with each other and then come back to the larger discussion. And I had a student in an evaluation once write, I'm paying good money to have an expert teach me. I don't want to deal with students who don't know anything. So that's actually an area where I've had resistance for students not wanting to interact with other students and not wanting to have to. I think some of our better students think I don't want to waste my time teaching someone else. And we have students who are feeling less confident, who don't want to interact with the students who are going to make them feel bad. So I think some of it comes back to these social interactions. We are asking 18 to 21-year-olds to enter a new world and experience a lot of growth emotionally, socially, and now technically. And we're asking a lot when we put them into these interactive groups, but that's what their career is going to be. In any engineering discipline, you are working on project teams, you are working with people, you are interacting with clients, you're interacting with sometimes government officials, and you have to be able to communicate with others in both the technical and the social areas. So that was surprising to me, but that is one of the areas I've seen the most resistance.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that. I remember facing like issues like with groups in high school, thinking, oh, it'll change in college, and then it continues in college. And like now I'm realizing that it's going to exist in every like aspect of like work in life. So thank you. Next, I'm going to pass it off to George.
Okay, yeah, so I think like Kathy S., I don't know that I've had a ton of experience with things that didn't work, but I am always trying to I'm very sensitive and try to dial my approach in as best I can. I mean, the one thing I mentioned earlier about, interactive conversation in class, and by the way, I actually encourage class participation by adding a component to the grade, which is anywhere from 10 to 20% of the grade is class participation. So it's a big chunk, and that makes people nervous, but it also makes them talk. So yeah, I talked about the dominating by 5 or 6 or 7 of the most extroverted students in the class. The other thing that I tend to try to do is, and it's based upon sort of just sense the feedback that I get when I approach it, is I try not to get too overt around the numbers and make it too mechanical an argument. Wow, I would never say anything like, well, 14% of our aerospace students are female. That's awful. We need to fix that. It's more about how do we make the environment more attractive and more inclusive so that everybody can join in. I mentioned at the very beginning of the call about how I'm so excited about the 3 teams that were in my class this year. They're starting to adopt female representation at the captain level, but also sub team leads, and the percentages are growing there. I don't focus on the percentages themselves. I don't say, well, we have 3 teams in here, we should have at least one of these has a female captain, because that's representative, and maybe by rights it should be 2, and then we need to have sub team leads and these numbers, etc. I focus more on, hey, you captains, we want to create opportunities so that we can create the bench strength and get really, really qualified candidates that more represent society, and then start to move them through organically. And if I focus on that, and I just focus a little more subjective, sometimes it's frustrating because it feels like we're not moving as fast. But the old adage, sometimes you have to take 1 or 2 steps back, or maybe you need to walk before you run. And I think if I notice that when I do that, as opposed to get sort of like really overt about it, more mechanical, it tends to resonate better, and I get better results. Does that make sense?
Can I jump in here a little bit? I had to laugh when Kathy was talking about the evaluations from students. An evaluation I get very typically is that I'm intimidating. And I now start the class and say, look, I'm old and I'm tall. I can't help either of those things. You're going to have to get past it. Right. And so, be intimidated. I'm a lecturer. Be intimidated by a full professor. And so and it's a real trick, because I spend so much of my time telling the students what they're doing wrong, that I need to have them be comfortable with coming into me and saying, okay, how do we fix this, rather than being afraid of me because I just told them that they did this wrong. And that's a real interactive thing. That's what office hours are for, which of course is much easier live than it is on Zoom. But I also wanted to mention that my greatest learning experience was when I had a student in my class one time who was deaf. And it was the first time I realized how much I run around a classroom, turn around and I'm not talking to the students themselves. I'm kind of talking to the chalkboard or whatever it is, because this student needed to read my lips. And so it kind of, I don't know that it completely changed my style of teaching, but it made me aware that it's better to engage the students in a way that when they can actually see my face and read my lips. So it was a whole new perspective that I had never had before. And I will be forever indebted to that student for being willing to, and she was very good about it. She kind of educated me through what I needed to do to make her understand the class. And it was really terrific. It was a great learning experience for me. And she did get through the class. She was very bright. And so it was very fun. So I thought I'd add that as kind of an extra, something that doesn't normally happen in the classroom.
Can I add something to that too? Actually, two things to that. One, Kathy, I'm intimidated by you, so I'm not surprised that your students are as well. But having said that, I think it's a great point, because that's the one thing that I don't do enough of, is to really try to understand the needs of my students in the class. I couldn't honestly tell you if I had anybody who's hearing impaired in the 2 years or so that I've taught here, and it's because I'm just insensitive to it. And I think that's a great point. One thing that I will definitely take out about this is that I probably need to try to understand that better. I don't know how to do that, and maybe I'll go to my Yoda, who's Ken Powell here, and talk to him a little bit about this offline. But I think that's a fabulous point that I really don't think about enough, and I will definitely start to think about that more going forward.
Thank you so much for that great discussion. That actually reminds me, my older sister is getting her master's degree in human-centered design, and she did a project recently where one of her teammates was deaf, and they were most familiar with Chinese Sign Language, and another of her teammates was fluent in Mandarin. So it was a bit expensive to afford a translator for all of their meetings, so they often interacted. My sister would speak in English, and then their teammate would translate it into Chinese, and the deaf student would read the Chinese speaker's lips. It was absolutely fascinating how much she learned from that experience. Anyways, I apologize. Yeah, so our next question is very related to this one. If you all have faced any roadblocks in implementing DEI practices that you think would be useful to highlight. And let's go ahead and start with Ken on this one.
Thanks, Piper. So in the very early days of me getting engaged in this kind of work, we would see explicit pushback from some faculty when we went into departments to talk about trying to hire for diversity and why diversity and excellence go hand in hand, and just educating them about things like unconscious bias and imposter syndrome. And we used to plan very carefully who was going to sit at what tables and who the problem faculty were likely to be and who was going to moderate the discussion at that table and things like that. And over time, that became less and less of an issue. We got better at it. And as we got more of the message out to more of the departments, it just was less prevalent. Now, I still find when I go to other schools, sometimes it's like seeing University of Michigan 10 or 15 years ago at some schools. Ted Bergen, who's the chair of astronomy, and I went to a school that will remain nameless, and it was like, I felt like I was in a country right before the revolution. It was, the older faculty were questioning everything we were saying, the younger faculty were nodding their heads and saying, yes, yes, we need to do more of this. It was quite an experience. I think another thing that in the early days was a problem, and now at Michigan is not, but at other schools is data scarcity. I mean, Michigan, I think, has been way ahead of the curve on being able to answer data-related questions around demographics of the faculty, demographics of the grad students, who's succeeding, who's not, what factors into that, and so on. And you can see stuff going on with the Atlas project and so on that are along these lines. Many other schools aren't up to that speed yet. So I think at Michigan, our biggest challenge by far is the reward system, and faculty priorities, and just the concept of, or the issue of fatigue, right, of the people doing this kind of work. So as faculty, most of our rewards, our tangible rewards, come from succeeding at research. We're expected to be good teachers, but we're expected to take intrinsic happiness from doing a good job teaching. We don't really get extrinsic or explicit rewards for teaching well, in terms of salary or raises or promotions or things like that. And with service, it's even more the case. Basically, there's some expectation of doing service, but it's very uneven across the faculty, and mostly people step out of altruism. And I think if you look at who's on this panel, right? I mean, Kathy Severner's a special case because DEI is in her job description, but she does a lot of things for the college around some of the data things I'm talking about, for example. But if you look at the rest, I mean, Kathy Clark and Ella Atkins are both chairs, basically department chairs or associate chairs. George is running a master's program. King's running a huge research group. I run a PhD program in the undergrad program advisor. And so I think the people who are engaging the DEI work are the same people who are doing a lot of the other, service work. And so fatigue is a real issue, I think. And we need to broaden the pool of people who are stepping up to do this work. I think that's the biggest obstacle at Michigan in the College of Engineering right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Ken. Kathy Sevener, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd actually like to build on what Ken was saying regarding the incentive structure. I heard Kathy say she's a lecturer and I'm also a lecturer, and we are not part of the tenure track. And so there are certain things in terms of recognition and rewards and that type of thing that I think the college needs to carefully consider. But a big problem in addition to the fatigue is simply time and resources. Are we giving the faculty who want to engage the time that they need to really take a look at their courses and make the substantial changes that they might need to make? Are we giving them the tools? And that's part of the inclusive teaching interviews that I've been doing, was to collect some of those tools, some of the examples of what faculty have been doing and been successful with, and then disseminate that and share that among faculty. But we all go to these various classes to learn about inclusive teaching, and we're like, yeah, that's great. That would be really a really neat thing to try in my class. But I'm barely holding on right now, and I simply don't have the time to even think about how I'm going to restructure my course to actually implement that. So for the chairs who are on this this meeting, to think about the time and the resources that we're offering to the faculty.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Oh gosh, I almost knocked my notebook off my desk. Ella, have you faced any roadblocks in implementing DEI?
Yeah, I want to talk about the individuals, and I want to talk about two particular roadblocks. One that I'm learning more about as I advise kind of a broader range of PhD students is the difference between, and I resonate with this personally as well, so it's easier for me to learn about it. The difference between a student whose family has pushed them out and said, we are going to be so proud of you if you're successful in your career, and then they cheer you on from the background, versus the student whose family has no idea what they're doing. Right. And someone who's going to come from an underrepresented background where maybe neither parent has gone to college is going to see that second situation. And in that situation, it turns into a roadblock in two ways. One, you don't get that emotional support from your family because they'd have no idea that you're being successful. So all of those journal papers and grants that you win, right? They're like, okay, I'm glad that what are you teaching? Are you doing something like a high school teacher? And I can't tell you how many of these conversations I've had with my relatives, but I see my students in similar situations, and I kind of feel like, how do they do this, right? How do they go home and tell their families that what they're deciding to do that's really important in their careers and their life is writing papers? And so there's that. And then the second thing that's a roadblock is, in many of the same situations for these students, they need to make money to help their families, not just kind of work on building up their own academics and their own portfolio of money and properties and whatever. And it's just a different life. It's a different life if you need to give back because your family needs your support, rather than being in a position where it's all about you, and the success that you can have. So that's a roadblock. It's a really serious roadblock that needs to be understood and helped by this kind of personal interaction with people who may have experienced similar things or who have understandings not only of the statistics but also the implications of how you in the later aspects of your career can utilize and leverage all this hard work you're doing to write these papers that no one might care about to make a difference back home as well as in whatever professional field you're in. The second thing I want to say, which is very gender related, is I have always, how do I say this? There's no way to say, I'm going to insult my husband here. I have always been jealous of people who have stay-at-home spouses. And I mean, there is just, I spent 21 years of my life having no leisure beyond what I did with my children. I mean that seriously. There was nothing that I did that wasn't either professional or with my kids or sleeping. And it's not like that for everyone. That needs to be out in the open. It needs to be discussed. I don't know what to do about it because there is an imbalance. There are way more stay-at-home females than there are stay-at-home males. And, you know, that tends to reflect back in the professional community in a negative way, in the sense that even if you have given up everything except your kids and your work, people assume negative things like, oh, we can't include her in this committee because she's busy. And then you get shut out. The flip side of that is they're like, well, you know, she wants to be involved in everything, so we're going to put her in 10 committees, many of which are not really important and they don't help your career. And then there is no balance in that side as well. So as if you're old and wise, right? I'm not tall, but I am old, like Kathy was saying earlier. You become selective and you're able to say, yep, I'll do that committee because that makes a difference. And I'm not going to do that committee because that's just busy work. But when you're young and ambitious, you don't realize all this is happening until you wake up later and you realize, I haven't been to an art event. I haven't, long list of stuff for 20 years. And that's something that needs to be discussed in events like this and others.
Wonderful. Yeah, very, very salient things. So like important things. So thank you, Ella. In the last less than 10 minutes, we are going to do a final kind of wrap up question for all the panelists that are interested in answering this question. Is like, what do you do of, like, what do you dream of doing for DEI in the future? And how can the aerospace professional community like help support in the long term? So like that was a question that like that Ella was interested in answering, but mostly the question is like, what do you dream of doing for DEI in the future? To answer that in the last few minutes, I will start with Kathy Salvator.
Thank you for that question. And I'm actually going to use this as an opportunity to circle back to some of the things that Ken and George and Ella said at the very beginning. It's incredibly important for the majority to take a look around. So there's a meeting that I go to at the end of January every year with materials within the aerospace community. I worked in the aerospace industry for six years before going back to academia. So I've been attending this meeting for over 20 years. And when I first started attending the meeting during the plenary session, I'd look around a room filled with 300 people and I could count on one hand how many women were in the room. 20 years later, I can count on two hands now. At least we've made that progress, but that's not that much. And it would be, it comes back that this community, part of it was what Ella said about attending DOD events. This particular meeting is heavily influenced by DOD. And I was recently asked by an AFOSR program manager how he can improve the diversity within his portfolio. And, you know, the simple things like, who are you inviting to review the proposals? What are you telling them are your criteria? And do your criteria include anything to improve the diversity of who's getting the awards? Because that then influences what students are hired and who's doing the research and who gets the recognition and the papers published. So within the professional community, I would really like to see more of the majority step up and look around in a meeting and think, how can I make this meeting look more representative? What can I do to change the culture? And then as far as a dream for DEI, one of the things I struggle with here at Michigan especially is pipeline. And I've really, over the last couple of years, been thinking about our structural inequities within our culture and how, what can we do as faculty at this university to help broaden the pipeline and bring students in who will help us get there. And make sure that they're getting the support that they need early on to be able to attend Michigan, be admitted, attend, and be successful here. So that's another area where even the aerospace community can be helping out.
Thank you. Ken?
Thanks, Megan. I guess, I mean, basically, I've committed for the next 2 years, starting in September, to being the faculty ombuds for the college. And I'm hoping that in that role, basically, I can be a resource for people who feel, faculty, who feel that they're running up against roadblocks. And I think, I mean, I had to choose. I was asked if I wanted to serve on the or be nominated for the executive committee, which does a lot of the hiring. So I felt like that I could maybe make an impact there, or with this ombuds position. And I decided that the ombuds position was one where I might be able to help more really underrepresented faculty, or faculty who don't have as much wherewithal as they should, and hope I can help out that way for the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. Catherine Clark?
Sorry, I was muted still. It's interesting for me to hear this conversation, because I don't remember feeling that there was a huge inequity situation at NASA itself. We have female flight directors, we clearly have female astronauts, we have female engineers. There may have been more males, but for the most part, people sort of didn't care what as long as you did the work, right? They didn't care, what your gender was, what your gender preference was. I mean, nobody cared about any of that. But I agree with Ken. I think that, one of the real answers here is this pipeline issue. If you want engineers to be of underrepresented communities, you have to bring them in and educate them and get them ready to play the role. It's important to have people be able to see themselves in the leadership positions. So faculty have to be of color, of different genders, of all the underrepresented minorities, and we have to do whatever it takes to get that pipeline filled, because ultimately that's what's going to make a difference. Again, even at DoD, it's are you qualified to do the job? And certainly at NASA, are you qualified to do the job? It's a little bit like, you have to be this tall to ride this ride, right? The hoops are very, very large for being qualified to do any number of those jobs that go on, because the stakes are so high. And so getting more qualified people into that pipeline, into those jobs, into those positions is probably, for me, the biggest dream that I have. We did have a huge issue when I was at NASA. Someone had this clever idea of having a women's mission in the space shuttle. And this was going to be a really big deal, great for women kind of thing. And the women astronauts actually flew to headquarters and asked me to stop it from happening, because they said, we are too good and we work too hard to be good engineers, good pilots, good scientists, to have someone say that having boobs is going to get me on the shuttle. And so when I was interviewed, I was the woman chief scientist, and I was interviewed about what I thought of the women's mission, and I said it was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard of in my entire life. Unfortunately, what I didn't know is that at exactly the same moment, the administrator of NASA was saying he thought it was the greatest thing for women. And it turns out, just a little hint for any of you on kind of looking at your future, making your boss look like a blithering idiot is a really bad idea. And so I got dragged into his office, not quite in handcuffs, but it was close. And I think he wanted to fire me on the spot, but he couldn't help himself. He had to yell for a little while. And finally, I realized I was toast. And I said, wait a minute. Would you ever stand up in front of a crowd of people and say that you must be male to get on this shuttle? He said, well, no, that would be sexist. I said, then why the hell do you think it's okay to stand up and say you must be female? Give these women credit for what they actually do. be good scientists, being good pilots, being good commanders, being good engineers. And he looked at me, and I think it took him about 30 seconds. It felt like about 10 years. And he finally said, okay. And that was the end of the women's mission. So I said, you know, we're going to get this right when you have the best commander for the mission, the best pilot, the best couple of engineers, and the best scientists. And they all happen to be women or people of color or people of, you know, any minority, and nobody notices. That's when we win these issues. And so you have to fill it. You have to be ready to have those people there to do those jobs. That's the pipeline issue.
Yeah, that's a very powerful story. Thank you, Catherine. We're like, it's 12:30, but like we have like two more panelists to like quick, like any like, I don't know, 5-second thoughts on what you dream of doing for the future, Ella and George, and we'll start with Ella.
Yeah, I want to follow up. What I was going to say that was not nearly as eloquent as what Kathy said is I dream of the day when I walk up to another individual and they don't judge me for how I look or sound. And I know I'm going to be trying not to judge them for how they look or sound. We're not there yet. And we need to be vigilant that we don't make these accidental mistakes when we walk up to people of just judging based on what we see. And the same applies to undergrads, to grads, to professors, to lecturers, to staff, everyone, everywhere. And it's hard to get there, but I think the more rich interactions that you manage to find during your time at the University of Michigan in careers and in life, the easier it's going to be for you.
Thank you, Ella. And like quick, like last few words of wisdom, what do you dream of doing for the DEI in the future? George.
You know, Megan, first of all, I was about to thank you for not making me follow Kathy Clark's beautiful speech. I'm thinking, oh my God, Megan, she's got my back here. But then I had to follow Ella, who said exactly what I was going to say. I think my long-term vision is that we actually come in here and we, with all due respect, because this panel discussion was fantastic. It actually exceeded my expectations. Megan and Piper, awesome job. Keen, thank you for your championship. Christina, you guys, great job help getting this thing organized. But my dream would be exactly what Ella said, and that we wouldn't have need for discussions like this. But you know what? It's going to be a long, long time to get there, and we need to just, you know, chip it away as best we can. And so my vision then, short term, is that we actually have this dialogue. We have more privileged people involved in these dialogues, and we just start to make change step by step.
Thank you.
Great. That's a nice note to end on. So I want to thank Piper and Megan for doing a fantastic job moderating this panel. Also all the panelists for their time. I know you get a lot of requests for this kind of activity, and so really appreciate you accepting and coming and discussing this with us, sharing your insights and personal experiences. And I hope you, the audience, were inspired to do even more inclusive teaching and learn something today. I certainly did. And also, as a reminder, this discussion was recorded, so you'll be able to advertise that to your colleagues and friends as you see fit. So again, thank you all, and yeah, stay tuned for more discussion and events coming out from us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.